Oh well. Mm. Hello everyone. How is everyone doing today? I'm hoping you guys are actually doing pretty well on this Friday. Yeah, it's actually Friday here. We don't have snow anymore. Welcome Han Dupuis. Yeah, I think snow is almost over in Canada right now. It's starting to rain. Like a few days ago, there was this big thunderstorm, and today's subject is going to be very simple. But before starting, I would just like to say, oh, welcome, Dave. I would just like to say thank you to all those who followed me on those lives so far, and I would like to meet new people. Don't forget to answer the questions in the descriptions. Welcome Wasif, welcome Dave again. So yeah, today we're going to talk about fantasy and manga, and anime, hopefully actually, because anime is something I know more about, so I can help you guys more about anime subjects. I can just talk more about it than actually manga. Not that I don't know a lot of fantasy manga, I actually sure do. But yeah. So yeah, tell me. Oh, welcome Mario. Tell me what's your favorite fantasy universe, by the way, in the comments. The comments right under. So yeah, today maybe I'm going to go first through the origins of fantasy in the manga and anime industry, and then talk about how it evolved to this day, and maybe share with you guys 4 fantasy manga that I find absolutely wonderful and that I think everyone should be reading. Welcome Olivier, welcome Marie-Frédéric. Don't forget to tell me in the comments your favorite fantasy universe. It can be a manga, a movie, an anime series, or even a video game universe. It doesn't matter, because all of those actually you're going to see they evolve in parallel to each other. They actually relate to each other in certain ways that we might not expect. But let's start with welcome Jose. But yeah, let's start with the very beginning, the original origin of this kind of passion for Western style fantasy, because you can see that in Japan there's a lot of Japanese style fantasy. For example, Demon Slayer, Naruto. Those stuff are really Japanese style, with the Japanese style weapon culture and lifestyle, I would say. But most of you have already have seen those Isekai anime, I guess, and even more any type of fantasy manga. And you're going to know that when we talk about fantasy, the first thing that comes to your mind is actually not Japanese style fantasy, right? It's actually the European sword, Middle Age stuff, with dragons, magic, kingdoms, I would say. Welcome David Lajoie. So where did all of this begin? Well, it actually began with one singular man named Osamu Tezuka. Okay, most of you knows about Osamu Tezuka, but I'm going to reintroduce this person again. So Osamu Tezuka can be considered both as the founding father of animation and also as the founding father of manga in general, because he was drawing manga before getting into animation, where he spent the rest of his life doing essentially mostly animated series. And one of his most known works is it's simply Astro Boy. Also the first westernized series, which means it's the first Japanese anime to be imported into the West. Well, Osamu Tezuka, unlike some other people of his era, of the first ages of anime and manga, like Hayao Miyazaki, for example. He was mostly inspired by he was mostly inspired by Disney. And when we talk about Disney, we're talking about stuff, for example, like Sleeping Beauty, or other stuff like The Little Mermaid, for example, or even there's so many European style, The Beauty and the Beast, for example. All of those are actually the beginning of the inspiration of Osamu Tezuka. When he was young, he kind of looked at those with fascination. That's how he based his art style of Astro Boy, based on Disney arts. And of course, from there on, the animation of Disney will be seen by him as top-notch quality. He will see it as a kind of inspiration for most of his works. And then came one day where he had this idea, a very crazy idea actually, to make his own Western fantasy movie, which is called Kanashimi no Belladonna, or the Belladonna of Sadness. This movie is better for viewers who are at least over age, like over 18, because it has some blood content, some gore content, and some explicit content. But it was one of the major original works that introduced Western style of animation to the Japanese industry. Gates Jieitai Kanochi te Kakutata Kairi. Is that like, oh Maxim, welcome by the way. Is that like is that the entire thing is manga title or something? Hold on, I have to look for this thing. Okay, so Gate Jieitai Kanochi Ite. Oh, okay, it is actually, I do not know this thing. Okay, holy, oh yeah, I remember that anime passed actually, not so long. It's not that, oh, it's actually, yeah, okay, I see how it is. It's kind of one of the more creative kind of isekai. I would imagine it looks isekai a lot because it has those modern military uniform designs. Yeah, well, okay, that's actually a discovery of the day for me. Thank you for sharing us. So yeah, back to the subject. Kanashimi no Belladonna is actually very simple of a story. It's a story about a woman who should have been married, but she gets kind of in trouble and has to ally herself with the devil to get out of her trouble. That's, that may be a very blunt description, but the entire thing is set to show a lot of like bad sides of society. We're thinking about religion. We're thinking about middle-aged society, like the witch hunt kind of content. So I really cannot say too much about it without it being gore, and include like some of the most perverse or twisted content that Kanashimi no Belladonna has. But for some of you who don't know, in modern animation industry, like right now, we usually have this kind of very concrete forms in the animation. When, for example, a character when a character is drawn, they are drawn to look like the actual body form. We usually don't create like deformities, for example. We usually don't do too much anime metaphors when it comes to it. So we're used to having animation being kind of, it's almost like real life movie, but with like how should I put it? It's like real life movie with actual actors, but just animated instead. Welcome, Clark, by the way. So yeah, but that was not always the case. Like we take for granted that all the human shapes are going to, respect the physical body boundaries, but that was not always the case in the history. And Kanashimi no Belladonna was one of the first anime movie where you could see that there was so many metaphors in the movies used by distorting like the human body in the movie to give different shapes, to create metaphors, to not to have explicit content, but at the same time it was the earliest stages of anime, so censorship was not there, so they could put any kind of gory thing that they wanted in the anime. And anime in its origins and manga in parallel are basically lines drawn by talented people, so those lines are not like real life bodies where I could not, for example, take my hand and split it into two and then shape it into a hammer, for example. But this kind of transformation can happen in a manga because of this freedom that we have with the lines. And this kind of freedom is kind of very important at the earlier stages, because as you can see as you will be able to see in Kanashimi no Belladonna, is something that the creators of the earlier stages are going to use so often. Welcome Stefano, welcome David Morin. Don't forget to go in the comments and tell me what's your favorite fantasy universe. Take a minute or two to think about it if you want. But yeah, back to it. Well, considering that that drawing style, you have to actually understand that we evolve from a state where we have so much freedom of creation because we could do anything with the lines, to a state today where we essentially have to make realistic things. One of the reasons I would believe is because the audience found it very confusing actually to have like abstract forms, like in one scene after seeing like perfectly humanly shaped forms. They found it like really confusing, like really difficult to understand for most part. So that's why I believe today we have much less of that, and also because of the fact that we have seen so much creativity in the past, but today it's such a big question of money that we don't necessarily have the most creative and talented people doing animation project. It's mostly like people with the right contacts from the right companies like Sunrise, Toei. Those they still have the money to actually do it. So yeah, each animation is still up to those who produce it. For those of you who know Attack on Titan, well, it passed to the hands of Studio Mappa for the final season, and you can see that the drawing is a lot less. It's still good, but it's a style that actually represents the manga much more. While before the first 3 seasons of Attack on Titan was drawn in a style that wanted to create its own, it's anime, so let's create a new style, a new way of drawing characters. Like there was kind of inkling around the characters, like around their body shape. There's like huge thick lines of ink around them to distinguish them from the rest. Something that you are not going to see with Studio Mappa, because they want to maybe get closer to the actual manga style. If you look at how the characters are drawn, their face, it looks much more like the actual manga. Welcome Jonathan, welcome Lou, and welcome Thomas Bazin. Don't forget to type in the comments your favorite fantasy universe. So yeah, on that note, well, let's continue a bit. So from there on, this Disney-inspired Western fantasy animation will start to become more and more interesting to the Japanese audience, because you could create stories with a Japanese type of narration that were not existing at that moment in the West. And you could create so much deeper stories than the superficial cartoon that you could find in the West at that. We're talking about what, the 60s, 70s? And from there on, in the 60s and 70s, there will be a massive wave of manga and anime in Japan that will be happening with a Western middle-age culture type. You can think, for example, Dragon Ball, for example. Dragon Ball has, and also Dragon Quest from Akira Toriyama, both of which has a lot of Western and foreign inspiration. When you look at Dragon Ball, for example, there's not that many katana or Japanese styles of, like, at the first season there was like some ninja and some samurai characters, but after that it completely passed to, like, you know, the Goku's dress codes looks like a lot of Chinese clothing, and when you look at their weapons, the swords, and also a lot of the other stuff just looks so much like Western fantasy, because Akira Toriyama himself really loves Western fantasy, which is why I believe he continues to this day to work on his Dragon Quest series of video games. RPG is something that just fascinated him, and from Dragon Quest, from Fire Emblem, from Final Fantasy, you know, those games will introduce to the Japanese younger generation what is essentially European fantasy, and that will just inspire more and more of the next generation to even create more. And to this day, we have now so many isekai content. Like we have Konosuba, we have I would like to think Sword Art Online as a fantasy thing, but it's actually more sci-fi. But a lot of the design aesthetics of SAO is actually European middle-aged style. Welcome Tamisha, welcome Juliet, and welcome Noemi. Don't forget to comment your favorite fantasy universe. Yeah, and at some point, I believe what makes fantasy manga so interesting is not only the universe that you can create that are so rich, you know, because I would imagine that when you are a Japanese creator and you want to create something up with Japanese culture, it's very difficult to actually create something that is very creative without people actually, like, if you do like a Japanese type of universe like Naruto, for example, or even Orient, for those who know Maggie, like Maggie's author made Orient after, and try to make something really, really creative with it. Well, what happened at that moment is essentially that the people, your readers, are going to already know, like, what are the references. So they are not feeling exactly like it's an adventure into an unknown world. You know, Naruto from our Western experience is such greatness because it offers us something so different than what we're used to see. And then at that moment, when you try to create something with with Eastern fantasy, like Japanese style fantasy, it's just a question of time before you either lose your audience, like the audience don't understand where you want to go, or the other thing is that you're so used to always having the same codes of Bushido, of Yukai, that it's just extremely difficult for you to imagine something new that you want to work with, because you feel like you've seen it all. You've seen everything that is that could be created. So it's really, really difficult to actually create good story after that. While with Western fantasy, there's basically no limits. You can go, if you want to go about kingdoms. You can go on kingdoms. If you want to go about religion, you can talk about religion. If you want to, you know, because the fact that it is an unknown world to the Japanese society makes it so that Japanese society kind of has those fantasies. They are trying to imagine what it feels like to live in those in that era, in that magical world. So it makes their imagination work much more. And for the most part, if you look like Berserk or like Dragon Quest, they actually nail it. They actually make such a good job at representing European medieval ages. I would believe it's kind of similar to how our Western authors sometimes makes a lot of good contents, good movies on Japanese society, on Japanese fantasy stuff. I would believe that it's about the same type of vibe. So yeah. All right. So now that I've explained where fantasy comes from, I'm going to talk about 4 different works that I believe are actually, you know, probably the best, in my opinion, when it comes to someone who wants to actually see fantasy for fantasy world. None of the 4 that I'm going to talk about are Isekai, because I'm actually not a big fan of Isekai. I also think that Isekai sometimes don't pay enough attention to the world building. So when you want to get lost in an adventure, usually the content you're going to get is more like humor. When you think about the time I got reincarnated as a slime, or when you think about Danmachi, when you think about Konosuba, those are like more humor based. And while I do like humor based stuff, I just think that if you're here for fantasy manga, maybe you want something really big. You're looking for this big universe that has a lot of work behind it. It's important to stay hydrated, guys, especially during the winter and during the summer. Drink a lot of water. That's advice of the day by Simon. Okay, so we're gonna start our first title of the journey with Fairy Tail. Okay, I know that for you guys it's like reverse, because I think it's kind of reverse, but this is Fairy Tail. Okay, so needless to say why it is fantasy. There's no technology, there's a medieval era, and all the clothing styles are basically Western in nature. When you think about it, Fairy Tail is not your typical adventure, and that's why I actually think Fairy Tail is really great. Because, so see the evolution of the fantasy genre like this. Okay, it began as prince and princess stories in kingdoms, and then from those kingdoms we've had like Warcraft type of guild based RPG, and those RPG inspired Japanese creators to create their own guild based RPG, and from this guild kind of ideology, kind of style of community came Fairy Tail, where basically it's like a MMORPG where everyone has their own powers, but in a story, because, you know, quest, you know, the subject, the very topic of quests came from basically video games. That's from the very beginning, and Fairy Tail is all about quest stories. I believe that Fairy Tail has a lot of similarities with the older shonen. It's definitely a shonen manga, but where it's very different is that the art style of Fairy Tail, I think, is actually both very signature of Hiro Mashima himself, the author, and very simple to actually study and learn. Like if you want to actually learn how to draw like fairy tale characters, is actually not as complicated because it's much more similar to the typical manga design style. How you know, when you study how to draw manga characters, it's going to be much closer to that than to Naruto, One Piece, or Bleach, for example, or even Hunter x Hunter. You know. But now let's talk about the story. I think. Oh, let's see. We have a comment. Thank you for your comment, by the way. Aranza Laberdesque. Okay. I'm not going to do my English accent on this. I can speak French perfectly fine, so I'm just going to pronounce it in the French way. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I do understand your point about repetitiveness, but then again, you could say the same about Isekai. You could say the same about fantasy. You could say the same about like a lot of stuff. I do believe one of the reasons why we may feel like things becomes predictable is because we grew up with much higher standard storytelling from the manga. When you think about Dragon Ball, when you think about Naruto, when you think about I don't know, like the 2000s anime, those anime were really of greater creativity. But I think fairy tale is a bit more standard, a bit more basic, but it works its own universe really well. Like its own universe is really really deep, and you know, like the author basically first introduced a world and then built this world around it, and it did such a good job at building this world that I just think it's actually, it gives a very good result. And you know, I think when fairy tale began, all of us were like a lot into Naruto, a lot into One Piece, a lot into other stuff. So fairy tale felt to us like a breath of freshness. We felt like we were getting something new. We felt hopeful for the future. We were feeling like, you know, oh great, there's so many cool manga that are going to come. We did not expect that the manga industry will be going downward. We were expecting that everything from there on will be only more magical, greater. And I think fairy tale was this kind of, you know, transition. Like there was before fairy tale and then after fairy tale. And after fairy tale, we began to have manga industry and anime industry filled with fan service, filled with well, censorship, I would say, because you know, after Naruto, after Dragon Ball, the censorship began to become much larger. Like they began to censor so many stuff. The editors would read every single chapter before release and say, for example, oh, this is not okay, this I don't want this to happen, or like this story here could have been better, this kind of stuff, which prevents ultimately a lot of good stories to develop in a very creative way. And then because of those things, because those editors, especially from the Jump and from Shueisha, from Kodansha, those big companies, they want stories that are going to please the majority. So, and what do you do when you want to please the majority? Well, you do something mediocre. You do something basic, because that's what the majority is going to be able to relate to. You cannot create something too deep and expect the majority to actually understand it. And the problem between before this process and after is that before we actually made very great content, like even Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece, the editors intervenes a lot in the story making to make sure that it's going to be interesting for a majority of readers. But when you think about before that, even during Dragon Ball was supposed to end after Frieza, and it got dragged on because the Shueisha basically wanted to have more and more to sell. But you know, before that, manga was not such a big thing in Japan either. Like it was big because that's basically the only thing it was, but it's nowhere near the big industry that we have today. And I believe that developing this industry is actually thanks to those intervention, but sadly we're going to pay off by losing some creativity when it comes to story writing. And I do think that Hiro Mashima himself maybe he wanted to kill off some characters, but then maybe he or his editors decided that this character death is not worth it because our readers are essentially very young and they don't need to see that. And it's the same thing with happening right now with My Hero Academia. When you look at My Hero Academia and also Naruto at some extent, you want some good ending. There was a very interesting manga before. I think it was called Time Paradox Writer or something like that. Let me search it up for you. Okay, no. So it's Time Paradox Ghost Writer. So this manga was about a young man who traveled back to the past, or like back from the future, I would guess, where he basically copy like the next successful series of manga in the future and basically releases them as if it was his own work and basically steals kind of the fame. I think that is, a very cool concept, but it got cancelled last year because it was not popular enough. Why it was not popular enough? Because the mainstream Japanese audience basically looks at that and they don't like it. They don't like the fact that the main character has such a bad like sense of morale. If we look at before the kind of dark content we had and now, we can see that even in the darker stuff either doesn't go viral, like stays in the smaller magazines, or they go viral but then they have to like essentially be good ending stories for most parts. You will never have that's also why I believe if you compare Death Note to Platinum End, it's not the same vibe, right? Death Note was so mature, so deep, and when you look at Platinum End, it's like happy ending for everyone. It's I'm not spoiling anything because actually the manga is not over yet, I believe. I did not read the latest chapters, but I do know for a fact that the main character is more like basic than Light Yagami from Death Note, for example. And this will mean also that it's very difficult to create the stories like the creators want. And this is actually a problem that comes from the depth of the Japanese society. When you look at companies in Japan, everyone has to like the same stuff, like the same beer, dress the same way, and even be like about the same height. We want the people who are too different to go out, and we don't like difference. We like unity and being basically conformist. We want everyone to conform, and this kind of thing made it so that the tastes, like the trends, are going to become much larger. Where if you look at, for example, it's the same for the Western world too. The mainstream tastes are going to be like much bigger. It's not going to have a lot of difference in taste for the vast majority of people. But in the West, we have a lot more, I would say, critical thinking when it comes to deciding what we like. And because of that, there's a lot of times when something like will be made for a minority of taste and will still meet a lot of success. I have no example of that actually, but I would like to think that not all, that, for example, a lot of Marvel movies were made to please a minority of people who are basically the fans, and then they grow up to be mainstream instead of being made to please the mainstream audience. Like, you know, they didn't build the Marvel movies by thinking what will the mainstream audience like. Like at the beginning, with Iron Man, for example, at the beginning, they actually did that. But after that, it was all about what will the fans like to see. Like, you know, you put that reference, oh, yeah, you know, that's a reference to that character from the comics. You know, you create a fan base based on that. And so, as to say, yeah, so fantasy manga are going to feel to you guys maybe more repetitive from now on, and it's not going to change a lot. Like, you're going to maybe find some rare mangas that has like a really good pitch of beginning, but you can bet that that in the future, the editor is going to ruin the ending. Like, they are already deciding that Attack on Titan is not going to end the way the author originally wanted. So, you know, from there on, it's just going to be more intervention, because those manga are supposed to sell, and if you want them to sell, you have to create mediocre content. It's basically the demand creates the offer at the end of the day. While before, when we were at the beginning of the manga age, we didn't need to sustain the manga industry this much. We didn't need to have such high standards. So we created the demand with the offer. Like, people would buy what's on the market instead of we creating stuff so that to make it so that people will buy. You know, so of course creativity is going to be very different. And one other thing is that, for example, let's say Hiro Mashima does not have a good idea of a manga. Well, what he's going to do is ask advice to his editors, and his editors is going to give the same advice to him as to, for example, the author of Seven Deadly Sins. And then there you go, Seven Deadly Sins and Fairy Tail will have received the same advice from the same editor. And then they are probably going to have the same story development in some scenario. Not at the same time, but they're probably going to have some similarities. And, you know, that's just one way that it can happen. My favorite anime. My favorite fantasy anime and my favorite actual anime are not the same thing. By the way, my favorite anime, I don't know. I don't have one. Like, because for me, anime is a field of study. I actually study animation, the animation industry. I do have some movies that I really like, but I would say that I don't have a favorite when it comes to anime. It's like asking a chemist what's his favorite molecule. You see how how these questions will sound to me, because I'm someone who one of my actually field of study is actually to look at those anime, criticize them, understand where they came from, and understand how they were made. So so by doing this, the process of thinking, oh, this anime is magical, you know, I lose a lot of magic with each anime. But I would definitely say that I do find the animation of Naruto super great. I think Naruto is it's to some extent, especially Shippuden animation is so great. There's the Ghost in the Shell Arise or OVA that are basically a few mini films on the Ghost in the Shell franchise, and they use the same action animation type as in Naruto. You can see that the characters looks a bit alike in the way they draw them, their facial traits, and the way they move is also very alike. I really like those bodies in movement and in action for the combat scenes. I think that's really great. So I would say I don't have one. And also Sunrise. I think Sunrise. Okay, so here's the thing. You see, why is Gundam so important for anime? It's because unlike other animation studios, Sunrise, when they make animation, they actually don't simplify shapes. You cannot want to sell a Gundam figurine, for example, if you show a simplified version of it in the anime. So every single scene of the animation has to be drawn like with a lot of effort. So when you look at everything that Sunrise does, they don't simplify the shapes of the Gundams, or in Code Geass, the nightmare frames. They have to actually put so much detail, and I actually like this kind of details that they put. But yeah, so you told me your favorite is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. I will beg to differ on one thing here. I do not think that Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is very dark, because as much of cool content and philosophical image that Full Metal Alchemist brings to us, I don't think it's very dark, in the sense where I think the overall tone is quite not soft, but quite okay. Like, it was made so that audience of every age can actually watch it without being, you know, too traumatized from it and still understand the story. I think Hiromu Harakawa is an author that is really great, because she's a woman with an exceptionally great sense of morale and imagination. So whatever she makes, I always follow it. But I do like the philosophy behind alchemy. One thing that maybe you can think about on your own in the future, actually, because I was going to write a thesis about Full Metal Alchemist, the manga, actually, because there's something very interesting about alchemy. What is alchemy in the end? I think Hiromu Arakawa does not show it to us directly what she wants to say with alchemy, but that if you think about it, it's going to make sense. So here's how I interpret Full Metal Alchemist's alchemy. So alchemy is a desire. Alchemy is basically a desire, something that you desire right now. For example, you are thirsty, you want water. Well, you can create water with alchemy. You want, I don't know, a radio. Well, you can make a radio. But you can see it from the first story, actually, from the first story with the priest and the lion, well, the chimera, the giant parrot thing, and the girl named Rose. That this kind of story reflects perfectly well the morale of the entire manga, when you think about it. Just see it this way. Throughout the entire manga, throughout the entire anime, there is not a single problem that has been solved by alchemy, but a lot of problems that has been created by alchemy. I believe that alchemy is here to metaphorically symbolize our desires, our capricious desires, and that, you know, in the end, it doesn't really solve anything. You don't see any problem solved with alchemy. They fight with alchemy, they defeat opponents with alchemy, but the end game problem at the end of the day is not being solved by the alchemy, but by the people themselves. And alchemy is also a chimera. Chimera is an imagination, is what you will imagine, what you would like to be true in your imagination, your fantasy, basically, your dream, or you can say it like that. And one of the last sentences that Rose will say at the end of the first arc is to tell the Elric brothers that they should never have intervened, because without this illusion, without those hopes, how is she going to move forward and accept reality? And I believe that's where, you know, it's the most in-your-face kind of metaphor here with alchemy and desires in people, which is why those who make grave mistakes by abusing alchemy, those who makes the greatest mistakes, for example, Edward Elric, when he did like human transmutation, or the others, well, that is why the one who is judging them is called truth, because the truth is always going to be there to catch you up and punish you for abusing things. It's like they are trying to abuse what is unreal, like the chimera, and then they get caught by truth, who is here in their face to punish them for trying to live in this kind of lie or dream, or try to, do things not how they're supposed to do. And you can see that at the end, Edward Elric actually solves, spoiler alert, he actually saves his brother because he rejects alchemy. He renounces it. He decides to never use it again. And that's how the story actually ends. That's how the morale of the story, I believe that's why I believe it's all about giving up on capricious desires, on shortcuts, on easy magical things, and actually only accomplish the real, honest, and only accomplish things that have true value behind them. That's how I would put it. And so yeah, that's about it. And thank you for your compliments, Aranza. I have to go soon though, but I will answer your question at least. What I will describe as dark in anime, very simple. The story has to be full of, well, you could argue that what happened with Chris Tucker and his daughter Nina becoming a chimera dog is really dark. I will agree that that part is extremely twisted and dark. But I'm just saying after that, the tone kind of softens a lot. And we don't ever see really sad stories like that anymore. But dark in an anime, I would say something like Evangelion. I would say that is very dark. It's stuff that are essentially depressing, and always in a universe that is actually depressing. The world overall must be depressing. The world in Full Metal Alchemist is not really depressing. Sure, there was war and everything, but people are usually typically living okay. It's like one of the definition of dark fantasy is that evil must be stronger than good in those worlds. That's what defines dark fantasy when it comes to fantasy. Your dark fantasy is a dark fantasy if evil is stronger than any form of good, which is the case in The Lord of the Ring, where you see Sauron is essentially more powerful than anything in the movies, anything good in the movies at least. And you're fighting in a world that favors evil and where evil beings are essentially stronger than good beings. While if you look at Full Metal Alchemist, that's not necessarily true, because even if, for example, Vrat, who is kind of the leader of the country, is essentially a bad guy, well, what does he do really of bad to the people? He's just a bad guy serving another bad guy who is, yeah, of course, extremely powerful, but the father, the main villain, doesn't become relevant until the end, and he is defeated like within maybe like a dozen chapters. So that's it. The world of Full Metal Alchemist never becomes desperate in that regard, but the main characters does face desperation, but you can see that they are hopeful. They are hopeful that they are going to succeed. And it's not a desperation fight like Eren Yeager in Attack on Titan, for example, who is not really hopeful. He just wants to slice some titans. He just wants to use violence. I would believe that any dark anime must emphasize a lot on the necessity of using violence to solve problems. That I believe it's a good criteria. Like in a very dark anime, there's no actually positive solutions to things. There's only bad solutions and worse solutions, because they reflect a very dark view of the thing, of the the world by the author. If you're up to date with Attack on Titan scans, you're going to understand what I'm talking about. There's no good solutions in those guys. But if you look at Fullmetal Alchemist, the ending is actually quite soft. I would say quite positive, because it's just about learning a lesson. But thank you for your time, everyone. I'm going to quickly take some more time and introduce to you guys about the other fantasy manga. Okay, first Maggie. Here, for those who likes to see something new that is not typical fantasy, I think Maggie is really great of an adventure. It's like Arabic culture, but inspired by Arabic culture. I think Maggie is basically what happens when the Japanese audience gets interested in a certain culture but don't know everything about it yet, but wants to use the culture's style and folklore as much as possible. That's what happens. So you can kind of, imagine that at the beginning, when Japanese people were making Western fantasy manga, it was about the same as what happens now with Maggie. It's a lot of attempts and creativity, a lot of stuff that are not fidel to the actual culture behind it. And now, One Piece. Okay, One Piece, I think most of people knows, I believe. But what is great about One Piece is that I believe that the best stories about a subject are going to be the kind of stories that when you start the series, you don't expect that kind of stories. You expect something very cliche, very, you expect something very basic, simple, something that maybe you're familiar with in the genre. And One Piece is exactly that for pirates. People who love Western pirate stories are not going to expect what's coming in One Piece and what kind of story the author actually bring us toward. So, yeah, I think the story writing of a good story about a topic is always going to surprise you in that way, where it treats its subject so well that you don't feel like it's cliche. It belongs to the stereotype. If you look, for example, at even Pirates of the Caribbean, it's very creative, I would say, but it has a lot of cliche that you can see. For those of you who knows Assassin's Creed Black Flag, that's a very good example of story that actually goes toward what you expect and doesn't bring you anywhere else. So yeah, and then I'm going to finish with one dark fantasy manga. This one here is called Jubelblatt. Jubelblatt. So Jubelblatt is actually a super cool story. This is a very dark manga, a lot of explicit content, but basically it's about a hero who reincarnates after being betrayed by his comrades. And 20 years later, after the betrayal, this hero, which you can see on the kind of reincarnates in a new body and sees that those who betrayed him took all the glory from him and his former friends. And from there on, he will start as a nobody with nothing but his skills. He has no friend because it's been like a lot of years now. So he begins and will basically wants to take on revenge on the 7 traitors who are not considered like heroes in the empire, despite the fact that they betrayed them and they don't deserve it. So he wants justice and he wants revenge. So yeah, welcome Bud Mark, by the way. So yeah, on those notes, thank you for listening today. This is going to be one of my last lives actually for the time being, because I have a lot of tests coming up in the month of April. It's the end of semester kind of situation for me. I'm going to be writing some articles, some chronicles, on some subjects or manga that I actually know of. So just follow that on the O-Taku Manga Lunch Facebook page if you'd like to. And at the end of April, around April 24th, I'm going to be doing another live on Japanese music, on the music industry in Japan. So just follow me up on that. And I'm going to have a very good surprise for you guys during that live about Japanese music. What do I study? Thanks for the question. I actually study international politics, and I specialize in the issues in Asia, you know, like North Korea, China, Japan, and, you know, security questions in Asia and stability of that region. I believe that in the next 20 years, Asia is going to become very unstable, because right now we're at a situation where most countries in Asia thinks that they're super strong and they're better than the others. So, you know, tension is bound to become higher and higher and rise. So for me, it's really interesting to study those subjects. And I also study Japanese animation history, like basically how our animation made. And I look at Japanese animation with a very academic eye, like I explained earlier, the difference. So yeah, that's basically the two fields. I also studied a lot about Asian history, like China and Japan especially. So yeah, I may make some lives on those topics eventually, but yeah, for the time being, thanks everyone, and see you in the end of April. I hope all of you are going to be there. But yeah. Is there a course about the COVID around the world? I don't think there is a course, but you can look on the Canadian government website. I'm pretty sure they have very solid information there. But yeah, I also, by the way, I was in Japan during the pandemic last year, so I'm going to probably talk about this in my future lives. So yeah, on those notes, it's getting a bit late here, so see you guys later. Bye bye.